Welcome, AP Economics students. Today is day 4 in our review, and we are going to be looking at Units 5 and Unit 6 in macroeconomics. Unit 5 includes inflation, unemployment, and stabilization policies, and Unit 6 is, how do we get to economic growth? What does it look like? And productivity. So when we look at this slide, we notice that we're always dealing with, sometimes we have a recessionary gap, sometimes we have an inflationary gap, or we have full employment. I didn't put the full employment there because that's what you want. And if you had that, you wouldn't have any problems. And one of the big questions that people have about the economy is, okay, you can do fiscal policy, but it has consequences. You can do monetary policy, but it has consequences. What if you do nothing? What if you're dealing with a recession and you do nothing? What if you're dealing with an inflation and you do nothing? And the answer is that in the long run, the economy will self correct. And we see it self correcting on the bottom right hand part of your screen. Okay? So the idea is that if you are in a inflationary gap, and if you're in an inflationary gap, which is what you see in this graph right here, if you're in an inflationary gap and things are getting more expensive, the prices of things are going up, then what is going to happen is that workers are going to say, it costs more for me to get milk. It costs more for me to get bread. It costs more for me to pay rent or, anything else. I'm going to need a raise. And it doesn't happen right away. That's why we're talking about something that happens in the long run. But in the long run, because prices are higher, wages go up. And when wages go up, if you are a factory owner and wages have gone up, do you want to hire more workers or less workers? And the answer to that question is less workers. So what is going to happen is here we are at an inflationary gap. We do nothing. Nominal wages goes up. And owners, business owners, factory owners, whoever say, we are going to hire less workers. We need less workers because it's so expensive. So the short run aggregate supply shifts to the left, and that's where we get our new equilibrium. This was a self-correction. And it happens in a recessionary gap too. If you take a look at this graph over here on the right, here we are in an original recessionary gap. And if you know anything about a recession, you know that in a recession, people get laid off because it's a recession, and they are willing to work for less because they need a job. I always give the example, before the 2008 crisis, if you will, my dad had a pretty big tech job working at Bear Stearns, and he did really well. And after the mortgage crisis, Bear Stearns went out of business, and so did a lot of other companies. And what ended up happening is that my dad took a job for way less than he was making originally at Bear Stearns. And that's because people want to work. People want to take a job so they can provide for their family and those sorts of things. So in the long run, if you have a recession, a lot of people out of work, people are willing to work for less than they originally were. And because people are willing to work for less, if you're in charge of a company, if you're in charge of a factory, you're going to hire more workers because you don't have to pay as much for them. And so short run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right because this happens collectively in an entire economy. And here's your new equilibrium. There we see a self-correction. So that's how we see it in our short run aggregate supply, our aggregate demand, and our long run aggregate supply curves. That's what we look at, that's what we notice. In Unit 5 particularly, they put a lot of emphasis on showing these sorts of stimulations in what's called the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve always has inflation rate to the left. Unemployment rate is on your x-axis. I always remember it because I comes before U. There is always a vertical long run Phillips curve, and the vertical long run Phillips curve represents that natural rate of unemployment, and it's kind of like fraternal twin brothers with the long run aggregate supply curve. And maybe another fraternal, okay, let's say triplet, there are triplet, fraternal triplets, would be with the PPC curve, okay? So all of those kind of show your potential, your capacity, what it looks like in the long run. So in the long run, what your natural rate of unemployment is. Then we have these downward sloping curves because that's the relationship at high levels of inflation. We have low unemployment, and at low levels of inflation, we have high unemployment. So the Shortman-Phillips curve is always a downward sloping curve. That's why it looks the way that it does. And essentially, there's when the aggregate demand curve shifts or when the short run aggregate supply curve shifts, we see another either shift or movement on the Phillips curve. If the aggregate demand, looking at the bottom left of your screen, looking at that table that I put in there for you, if the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, that means that the curve's not changing, but there is going to be a movement to the left. So for here, it might go from E4 to C. Okay, if this was the short run Phillips curve that we're taking a look at. If AD shifts to the left, maybe there's some fiscal or monetary policy that shifts aggregate demand curve to the left. That means that the short run Phillips curve is going to have movement to the right. So maybe it goes from like C to E4. Okay, so that is, we're not drawing a new curve. We have arrows that show the movement in the direction. And it's always opposite. If you notice, AD shifts to the right, that means movement's going to be to the left, okay? AD shifts left, that means movement is going to be to the right. So they're always the opposite there, but that table is super important to understand what a Phillips curve looks like, what happens to a Phillips curve. I wouldn't be surprised if you were asked to explain, hey, here's what happens in the recessionary gap. This is the shift in aggregate demand. Now, what would that look like on a Phillips curve? And you might need to explain that in a sentence or two. Okay. The next thing on a Phillips curve, so if it's moving, it's the aggregate demand. If the entire curve is shifting, and if we are getting new curves, so if short run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right, that means that the short run Phillips curve is going to shift to the left. Notice how they're opposite as well. So SRAS shifts right, SRPC shifts left. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Because if we're taking a look at here, a rightward shift of SRAS, prices went down. And if you're taking a look at a leftward shift of SRPC, inflation goes down, which is representing prices. So it makes a lot of sense. Then we take a look at the short run aggregate supply curve. Let's say that it shifts to the left. That means that short run Phillips curve is going to shift right. So that's the Phillips curve. It's very important to understand what the Phillips curve looks like, what the labels are, what movements look like, what shifts look like. That's the important stuff here. The next thing that you need to be aware of is the long run interest rate. So this is a vocabulary term that I've seen them use more than once. It's this idea of money neutrality. In the long run, if you change the money supply, there's no long-term effect on the economy because what ends up happening is it kind of self-corrects. So here's the example. Let's say we have our money supply curve here. We have our equilibrium interest rate here. So an increase in the money supply, some form of monetary policy, maybe we're lowering the reserve requirement, maybe we're lowering the discount rate, maybe we're buying bonds, but something happens that we increase the money supply. And here's our new money supply. So in the short run, the nice thing is we have a lower interest rate, and that will make aggregate demand curve shift to the right. We see this happen. That happens in the short run. We talked about this at length last class when we were discussing Unit 4. But in the long run, when they say long run interest rate, long run, okay? Don't get confused with the short run. This only applies in the long run. In the long run, what happens with the increase in aggregate demand is now prices have gone up. And if prices go up, let's say that, before this monetary policy happened, let's say that, I could go to the grocery store, go to the ATM, take out $50 and be able to buy enough of those crazy yogurts that Hudson likes, some milk, some chicken, all whatever my groceries were. Okay. And I could do it for $50. But then monetary policy happens, money supply goes up, Kepler saying hello, and the interest rates go down. What that ends up meaning is that price level is going to go up. When price level goes up, now if I want to go buy those same groceries, I need to get the chicken, I need to get those yogurt things, I need to get the milk, all those different things. When I go to the ATM to go buy stuff at the grocery store, I demand more money. I need more money to do that. So money demand curve in the long run will shift right, and look where we are. We're back at that same interest rate. And so that is showing you those long-term effects. Okay? Um, so this is Unit 5 in a nutshell. Here's Unit 6 in a nutshell. PPC curve, whenever you want to demonstrate economic growth when talking about a PPC curve, that is a rightward shift. Whenever you want to show it, doing long-run aggregate supply, it's a rightward shift. Okay? Some of the most important things that they ask you is what causes long run growth. Maybe you get more resources, you discover oil or some kind of energy in your country. That can be long run economic growth. Maybe we have better education or training programs that are making kids more equipped for their potential. That could be a possibility. Maybe the quality of resources is better. Maybe technology is more productive. These are things that cause economic growth, long run economic growth. What you need to know, and the biggest mistake that kids make, is let's say your economy was performing where I have my mouse, which is probably in a recession. If I go from here and something happens where now I'm here, that is not considered economic growth. That's called meeting your potential. Congratulations, you're in macroeconomic equilibrium. That is not economic growth. Economic growth needs to be one of these big categories, okay? So make sure that you have an understanding with that, okay? Um, big things that you need to know, the rule of 70, that's the amount of time that what your growth rate, or how much it's going to take to, double your economy. You may be asked a source of economic growth. Increased investment in physical capital is a good answer. Don't say increased investment because it's kind of ambiguous. Some things you invest won't create economic growth. If I invest in physical capital, in more technology, and I have more potential, that is a good answer. The second answer, increased investment, that's ambiguous. You're not going to get credit for that. Okay, and the loanable funds graph we often see when we're talking about Unit 6, because this is the interest rate, the real interest rate that people pay on loans. When you have a situation, which is probably happening kind of right now, where the government is borrowing a lot of money, We call that crowding out. And that means that the supply of money has decreased. And when that happens, that makes interest rates go up. And what that could possibly lead to is higher interest rates, which means less investment type projects. Okay. So this is part of my Google Slides. These are all the different curves. You don't need to worry about the foreign exchange market. You can just pretend that it's not there. But money market, loanable funds, supply and demand, and aggregate demand and aggregate supply shifts. These talk about all the reasons why they shift. This might be a good place if you print this out, which I highly, 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 highly recommend that you do, and you draw some practice graphs just so that you have an understanding of what they look like. Okay, here's a free response question. The unemployment rate in the country of Southland is greater than the natural rate of unemployment. That must mean that we are in a recession. Use a correctly labeled graph of aggregate demand and aggregate supply to show the equilibrium. So for part A, see the graph. So notice here's my equilibrium. There's PLC, there's YC. Notice how it is to the left of the long run aggregate supply curve. This is signifying a recessionary gap. And they are going to, I guarantee, ask you, they're going to say unemployment rate is greater than natural rate of unemployment. You need to come to the conclusion that means recession, okay? The president of Southland is receiving advice from two economic advisors, Coelus and Raymond, about how to best to reduce unemployment in Southland. Coelus advises the president to decrease personal income taxes. Shout out to Unit 3, shout out to fiscal policy. That's what this is. How would a decrease in taxes affect aggregate demand? What you need to say for letter B, and you're definitely going to have to do an explanation like this on your exam, a decrease in taxes would increase aggregate demand because paying less taxes means an individual has more disposable income for consumption spending. So that's going to shift aggregate demand curve to the right because we know that C stands for consumption, and that's part of that C plus G plus I plus net exports. Letter B, the second part of this question, using a correctly labeled short-run Phillips curve, show the decrease in taxes. So notice they only want the short-run Phillips curve. I don't need to draw the long-run Phillips curve. So to show the decrease in taxes from point A to point B, point A is where my original is, and since I am shifting aggregate demand curve to the right, that means that I'm going to have movement from point A to point B, and that's going to be a leftward movement. Because we're talking about aggregate demand, it is a movement, okay? So that's letter B. That's what that graph looks like. Letter C, using Raymond advises the president to take no policy action. So what happens if you do nothing? What will happen to the short run aggregate supply in the long run? Definitely going to have to do an explanation like this. The SRAS in the long run will shift to the right because wages will fall because people in a recession are willing to work for less. They'd rather work for less than not work at all. And therefore, because you can get away with hiring workers for less, businesses will hire more workers and output will rise. So SRAS is shifting to the right. So when we draw our Phillips curve, now we're talking about SRAS. So it's not like a movement like this guy, it is a shift like this guy. And what we're going to do is because SRAS shifts to the right, that means that SRPC will shift to the left. And that's how you answer that question. Thank you for taking a look at this review, and I'll see you soon.